Tonight, what value do we place on the arts, a sector that was largely ignored in the recent election campaign? Will a change of government mean renewal? Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Virginia Trioli. We're coming to you live from Sydney tonight. Joining me on the panel, iconic Australian performer Darren Hayes, who's back in Australia briefly. Minister for the Arts, Employment and Workplace Relations Tony Burke. Artistic Director, Musician and Producer Katie Noonan, who'll bring you a special performance with the Australian Vocal Ensemble a little later. Cook, writer and TV presenter Adam Liaw. And joining us as a guest of Sydney's Vivid Festival tonight. And Shadow Minister for Science and the Arts, Paul Fletcher. Please make them all very welcome. Now remember, you can stream us on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. You can't avoid us. Quanda is the hashtag. Please get involved. And our first question tonight comes from Nick Newling.
The arts sector employs roughly the same number of people as the mining and telecommunications industries. Yet the arts as an industry was hardly mentioned at all during the last election campaign. What is the social framing of the arts in Australia, and why is it so hard to see its intrinsic value when compared to the economic value of other similar industries?
Great question. Katie Noonan, can I start with you on that?
Well, thank you so much for the question. I also just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country who are on tonight, the Gadigal people, and pay my deep respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Yeah, unfortunately, the arts is always seen as other rather than in, and you only need to look at education to see that music and the arts education is not valued in this country, whereas the other great culture, sport, is. And they're both wonderful cultures, but unfortunately, the arts are just not seen as integral to everyday existence. Whereas if you look at wealthy schools, all the wealthy schools have amazing music and arts departments because they know that the arts are integral to forming a well-rounded human. And not only that, arts education increases numeracy, literacy, mental health, sense of belonging, all the things that we know make us into good humans. But for some reason, we're always seen as other. And there are a lot of reasons for that to sort of, interrogate and break up. But it's been a tough couple of years to feel incredibly non-essential, whereas the arts are actually totally essential to being a human.
Well, Darren Hayes, you've just come back to Australia from being away for quite some time and you live overseas. So is there an answer you've got to that question, bringing a bit of perspective from overseas?
Yeah, it's incredibly noticeable to me that I know that this is a topic that's often discussed, is that whenever we face a tragedy or a trauma like we've been through, like this global pandemic, I feel like the artistic community is always called upon and we're always so willing to give of our services and raise money and to think of the other, which is ironic that, Katie just referred to us as being othered. And yet, there's just so much inequality when it comes to pay. I know that we can get into this later on, but in terms of, there are so few safety nets for performers. I know that people probably consider me to be somebody who, because in the 1990s I was working in a period where, I sold compact discs and...
Back when people paid for music.
Right?
Yeah.
But, so many of my friends and my colleagues are essentially gig economy workers, and this period of time for them was extraordinarily depressing, and yet we were relying on those people to lift us up.
Yeah, and we've quite a few questions on that subject as well. Adam, can I get an answer, because you sort of straddle a few fields here and you might be able to give us a bit of a business perspective as well on it.
Look, I think we do value the arts in Australia. We understand the personal value of it. We know that we need great art and we love to produce great art. What we struggle with is probably valuing it economically. We traditionally see the arts as being something that is non-economic. We do it out of love, we do it out of passion, but we do also need to value it economically as well. Right now we're in the middle of Australian Made Week, where we're looking at buying Australian goods or buying Australian products, and we understand the value of Australian produce. We know that that helps farmers. We understand the value of buying Australian goods. We know that helps manufacturing. We don't yet understand, or we don't make the connection that buying Australian content or understanding Australian service industries helps those industries. We need to look at the arts as an industry.
And yet we all know the figures. We all quote, $15 billion contributed to Australia's gross domestic product. I want to come to you, Tony Burke. As Minister, do you have a plan to actually grow that economy, the arts economy, and to make it at the centre?
Yeah, this is where Australia used to have a cultural policy. We had one first established under Paul Keating, then we had one under Julia Gillard. And when the last change of government happened, it wasn't that it was replaced with a more conservative cultural policy. It was replaced with nothing. And so effectively, for the machinery of government, be it education, be it health, be it arts and entertainment directly, effectively we've had a long period where there's no fundamental guidance as to why the sector matters. And what surprised me, and it goes directly to what Adam just said, because I had previously always wanted to argue only the cultural value of the sector, and that was what I thought was my job. What I realised when the pandemic hit was, for a whole lot of people, arts workers weren't even being considered workers. Arts businesses weren't being considered real businesses. And so now part of the job that we'll have to do with cultural policy this time is not simply look at the cultural value, but really make sure in a formal way Australia has acknowledged the economic power of this sector.
Paul Fletcher, as previous Minister, I know you'll want to address that, but let me go back to the question, because the question speaks to a longer period of time. It's not just about whether the previous government or even the government before had a proper arts policy. It's about how we regard it or don't regard it in this country. Do you have an understanding as why that is, given that you've had the portfolio?
Well, I think the arts is enormously important, and what we've been touching on here is, first of all, its inherent importance, the whole creative process on a continent, of course, where we've had 60,000 plus years of extraordinary creativity. But I think what this discussion has been touching on is also the economic importance of the arts. $115, $118 billion a year, creative and cultural sector, 600,000 plus people working in the sector. And what I think is interesting is as the economy transforms, more and more of us are becoming knowledge workers. The approach that has been central to the arts is relevant across more and more of the economy. And so you can look at things like digital games. That's a huge sector globally, 250 billion. We committed to 30% tax offset to boost the digital game sector in Australia. Great adjacencies with existing sectors like screen, like special effects, companies like Rising Sun Pictures in Adelaide or Animal Logic. And so by providing this support, you can then expand into the digital game sector. So more and more of that creativity having real, very significant economic implications as well as its inherent worth.
I want to bring in someone else to the discussion who's got a personal story about just how hard the last few years have been, and you've all experienced that. But there's an understanding here that maybe we've not misrepresented the arts, but not understood the arts as an economic force as well as we should have in the past.
I've always been confused why we haven't understood that. Like, if I put a gig in my town, I pay the crew, I pay my band, I hire the hall, I book a hotel room, I book a flight, the Uber driver drives me, all the restaurants are full because we're coming out. You know, the ecosystem created from one gig, and I am a small business, like a restaurateur, like all small businesses that have, struggled so much in the last 2 years. The ecosystem that we create is of enormous fiscal benefit.
Just quickly, if you can,
that was one of the reasons why we committed about $500 million in the end in COVID-specific arts funding, including the $220 million RISE fund. 541 festivals, events, shows funded, partly supported under that so far. Part of the thinking was we wanted to get shows going again when we knew that companies, promoters had run through their capital over the last couple of years just surviving. But in part it's because of that very important economic stimulation impact. Byron Bay Blues Fest, for example, the 2.4 million went into that happening at Easter this year. You look at the number of people employed, the artists, backstage crew, security, catering, it's huge. So the economic implications of the arts are very powerful. And that's the language that within Canberra is understood by people well outside the arts portfolio. So it's important language to be using.
Why isn't that reflected in programming though? Like a country like Canada has 40% of their radio programming is local Canadian artists. 50% of their television programming is 50% locally made. In Australia, the number is 20%, I think, on the radio.
I tell you what,
No, 6.25.
But let's put a pin in that, because we have a question later on actually about quotas and about what that should have in the landscape. So we'll get to that. But I just wanted to bring in Nidhi Sharma into the discussion now. Nidhi, whereabouts are you? Hi. Because, I mean, I know you've had a really difficult time when you moved to Australia 7 years ago. You were inspired by artists just like the ones that we see here to actually go ahead and join the live entertainment industry. But it's been very hard and you haven't really ended up living that dream, have you?
Yeah, so when I came to Australia, inspired by artists, live productions, the entire event life cycle, I knew it was a scene that I wanted to get into, but I also knew I had to go against all my sensibilities about money, where I might live, what my lifestyle might be.
You had to balance out a very insecure kind of life, right?
So to balance out having a career I loved, I'd have to give up the kind of, I guess, lifestyle luxuries my peers may have had. Yeah. And that has been a struggle for about 5 years, let alone the last 2.
So what have you ended up doing?
Luckily, I landed a job as a ticketing manager for 2.5 years, and then prior to COVID, and then last year I had 2 short-term contracts and 4 casual jobs just to stay in the industry, just to stay employed.
And what did you imagine, or did you hope your life was going to be like?
I didn't imagine like stars and hanging out backstage and all that, but I just imagined being involved in that joy that people get from events, just being a little piece in that thing. So when people go to a show, you can go, I was a bit of that. I contributed to that. People go home happy, and events bring joy. Music bring joy to people, and that's what you want to be part of.
But it's hard for you to make long-term decisions, I guess, and to plan like others might to own a home or to start anything else with your life.
Yeah, it's interesting. In a pub with my friends, I'll talk about like, mortgages and stuff, and they'll say, well, you chose to work in events, so what do you expect? And it's really like, it's accepted that poor pay if you work in events, poor pay if you work in this industry, which is a strange way to be.
Katie, can I get you to pick up on that? Because, I mean, you've been there at the beginning of your career.
Yeah, look, I know it's been... I don't think people realise how catastrophic the loss of income was. So when it started, it was 500, and then it was 200, and then it was 50, and then it was 10, and it was 2. Like yourself, I was working in the industry and I got, I think, date 3 into a 25-date tour. And I'm the sole financial provider for my family, and there was nothing for me to fall back on.
Let me just frame that for a second, because you're a household name, right? People are just going to assume that, you know, they hear your music, they buy your records, they see you performing. You must be rolling in it, Katie.
No, it's a gig-to-gig economy, and we really, you know, most of us are just going from gig to gig, and we try to save some. And I'm very lucky. I've been a full-time artist my whole life, which is a very rare privilege. Yeah. A very rare privilege. But I must say, the night when this fella passed the motion for artists to get JobKeeper and JobSeeker, and the Arts Minister voted against it, I was unbelievably depressed at the thought that the person that should have been fighting for my rights voted against it. And that was, you know, it was thanks to people like Tony that we were then able to get on JobKeeper, which saved my life. Like all other small businesses, well, I couldn't have survived without it. And I'm not afraid to say that. You know, I lost all my... It just went from 100 to nothing within... And the inequity between... And as much as I adore classical musicians, but the inequity between classical musicians and non-classical musicians has been pretty profound to observe. And it's a big discussion, you know, but it's been a very... Yeah, it's been a very challenging time.
Looking back on that, Paul Fletcher, was that a mistake?
Well, around 90% of people in the cultural and creative sector were eligible for JobKeeper. As you know, there was an economy-wide set of arrangements. So JobKeeper was about keeping people in touch with their employment, and then for those who weren't able to be supported by that, there was JobSeeker. So our focus was to get those economy-wide support arrangements in place. I made an estimate at the time that Tony was very critical of, that we believed that between $4 and $10 billion would go to people in the culture and creative sector. In fact, we had the Bureau of Communications and Arts Research check that number out, and that is how much. In fact, it was about $11 billion. So there's very, very significant support provided across the economy, but certainly within the culture and creative sector.
Except, of course, for all those who couldn't get JobKeeper, and that's where you go to JobSeeker. But these were people
Well,
who
but again, I
were
make the
working.
point. The analysis from the Bureau of Communications and Arts Research found that 90% of people working in the culture and creative sector were eligible for JobKeeper, and for those who were not, there was the availability of JobSeeker, and that was true of other sectors as
I'll get
well.
the Minister to jump in here.
Yeah, there's a bit of wordplay here. The term cultural and creative sector includes people who work in clothing retail. So when we're talking about cultural and creative sector, that ABS section includes everybody who's working in checkouts at Best and Less, as though we're now talking about artists. It includes people who work at the zoo. It's a definition of statistics as broad as possible to try to claim that JobKeeper reached further in the arts sector than it actually did.
Well, let's also
if you were, and I support that you had JobKeeper. We called for wage subsidies at a time that the government initially wasn't going to offer wage subsidies at all. I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
But if you were going to design a wage subsidy to exclude as many people as possible in the arts sector, you would have done it with the casual rules that you adopted, where instead of being 12 months in the industry made you qualify, it had to be 12 months with the same employer. And the nature of this sector, that rule just knocked people out left, right and centre.
Very quickly, because I want to come to Darren.
I just want to be clear because Tony has made this point before that in some way it's misleading to refer to the cultural and creative sector. There's press release after press release that Tony has put out referring to the cultural and creative sector being $115 billion, 600,000 plus employees. That is a well-accepted term used by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Within it, it includes performing artists, it includes libraries, it includes broadcasting, it includes digital. That is the definition of the sector, and then there's a series of subsectors within it.
Okay, Darren.
It just makes me really angry because you're completely dismissing the one aspect of everyone's employment, which is dignity. Dignity in employment. Everybody deserves to feel a sense of self-respect and dignity. You know, I did not come from money. I came from a proudly working-class family, and I've worked my entire life, and I have not always been successful. I've had some spectacular failures in the music industry. But, you know, when you're talking about a musician whose gig is from, you know, one self-funded gig to the next, I, for the last 15 years, have been an independent artist, not signed to a record company. I am my own boss. I employ so many people. I proudly do that. And, you know, I don't have an employer. I am my own business. And, you know, to say to somebody who is desperate to get a gig just playing at an RSL or, you know, that's been doing that for 30 years of their life, that they could just go and work somewhere else. And some of the messaging around that, yes, I live overseas, but I'm proudly Australian, and I watched all of that messaging about, hey, you could just retrain in like dismissing someone's worth. Like,
And we've lost so many great creatives,
So
and they
many.
went come back,
No.
sadly. You know, they've had to move into midwifery.
it was just
or real estate.
incredibly insulting for people who had given up their entire lives to perform for all of us.
Okay, let me hear from Adam on this.
I think it can be difficult to structure things in a way that captures everyone in the creative industry because there is no one model for being a creative person. There is, if you want to open a restaurant, you go get a lease, you incorporate a company, you employ a chef and you employ a waiter. It doesn't work that way in creative industries. There are lots of different ways to be an artist, and to try and, I guess, capture that is part of the difficulty in the creative economy, because it's not like a mining company, there's probably 2 or 3 structures that mining companies have, but for creative people, it can be picking up a guitar and walking out into the street and starting to play, or it can be setting up a company or incorporating or doing all these things. And part of that makes it very difficult to regulate an industry like that and to capture it with something like an emergency action in the course of a pandemic. And so I don't envy the people that have to do that, but we want to capture as much of that industry as we can, you know.
And in a way, we're our own worst enemy. We really need to work together in the way the sporting industry does. They obviously lobby well, they have the ear of Parliament, and our industry, we need to get better at representing who we are.
Well, let's go to our next question. It's a video one. It comes from Chloe Williamson.
It's no secret that being a working musician is largely insecure and exploitative, with the pandemic only making matters worse. This is why, for over 12 months, Musicians Australia members from the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance have been campaigning for a minimum fee of $250 per musician per gig. We started this campaign because right now there are musicians doing gigs subsidised by public money for fees of $100 and even less, which means they are receiving lower than minimum wage when you factor in all the additional work that is needed for a gig. Do you support the principle that musicians should get fair minimum fees?
We'll go to all the panel on this. I'll start with you, Darren. Minimum fee?
For sure, absolutely. Every other industry, you know, I'm so lucky this week I've been back in Australia, I've been working with so many creatives from makeup artists to fashion stylists to visual content people, and they all have very respectable minimum fees for what they do. And yet some of my best friends, bass players, you know, backing vocalists, whatever, how many times, Katie, have we heard the term, you know, do this for exposure?
Yep.
You know, it's so, there is no standard, and yet in every other industry, you know, there's a minimum call-out fee. There's a minimum call-out fee for a plumber, and there should be. Yeah. I get it, they train hard.
Katie, I'll just hear from you quickly if I can, then let's ask the Minister the direct question.
Oh, well, it just comes back to that idea of dignity. There is this thought that we are other. We're not in everyday life, and we are. I mean, imagine trying to survive the pandemic without a good book, a movie, all the creative things.
But you mentioned that you're your own worst enemy, and that plays into it as well, doesn't it? Because often the minimum fee, potentially, is being paid by a small operator, by, you know, a little local group or a pub or whatever, and they press upon you that they don't have much money to spare either. So, you know, let's all look after each other and I'll just pay you that. I mean, that makes it tricky, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, we've all done those gigs. My first gigs in Sydney were for 10% of the bar. We made $27 for a 7-piece band, and we were like, yes.
You got paid?
We got paid.
Wow.
I don't even know how you split that. So.
No, we bought a pizza. The difficulty, look, we are our own worst enemy, and the sort of, you know, the classical versus non-classical, and, you know, the pit workers versus...
Yes.
All of those things. There's some really good policy, though, in place that I think a group of about 16 organisations, including APRA and Support Act and Live Music Australia, they have a 3-point plan, which I'm sure you're well across, which really I think is a wonderful plan.
Well, let me ask the Minister, do you support the idea of a minimum fee?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do.
And who pays that?
Well, there's a few aspects of doing the minimum fee, but I mean, one is what can you do under industrial law? The thing that you should be able to do at the very least is also make sure that government's paying a minimum fee as well when government employs musicians. So these are the issues I want to work through and land on this year.
Does government often employ musicians?
Does it?
Does government often employ musicians?
Yeah, for events all the time. It's really common. And the concept of having minimum rates, like the argument, I hear the argument you put about, oh, but maybe the gig won't come off. You could say that about every occupation. Yeah, at the moment there'll be employers in every occupation saying, oh, but I won't be able to employ people. We're hearing it now in the discussion about the minimum wage.
Yeah.
That argument will always be there. We need to make sure that we are a country with minimum standards, and artists are an area at the moment where too often we just don't.
Let me just ask you a couple of quick questions on the issue of the minimum wage, because in your submission to the Fair Work Commission, you've asked for a 5.1% rise to the minimum wage. You've been silent on whether that should be passed on to other awards, saying you can leave that to the Commission. Given rising energy costs, rising interest rates, the big jump this week in particular, and continually rising costs of living, shouldn't that actually be included in your submission? Are you rethinking that? I mean, because everyone on a minimum award now is going to have to deal with this cost of living rising environment that we're in right now.
Yeah, well, that submission dealt with... We had the general principle in it that we don't want anyone to go backwards, but specifically the people on the minimum wage have the least savings. They have the least capacity to deal with it. And if you look at what's been happening with inflation, it's actually the essentials that have been going up the fastest.
I'm not arguing about that. It's more about your decision to be silent on the issue about whether that should actually apply to minimum awards as well. Are you rethinking that?
For low awards, that was included in our recommendation. So we didn't say minimum wage on its own. We said people who are low paid on low wages. So yes, those lower awards already covered.
Other awards?
On the other ones, we've left that as a matter for the Commission. Remember, this submission... No, because the Commission does have to work through whether or not they think there's an inflationary impact. There's clearly not for people at the lower end. They have to work that through. They've got the expertise to do that.
And do you think the inflation risk is too high?
Well, no, that's why we've left it to them. to make sure. If
But
they come out...
Is that part of the reason why you were silent on it, because you were concerned about the inflation risk?
No, because we know they've got the expertise on working that through. Remember, this is not the only thing we're doing about wages. This is just the first thing that we did about wages.
Okay.
There's more to come.
And just one more question on that. You've also said that you need to get productivity moving again. Do you think there are productivity gains to be made in this sector?
You can get productivity gains across the board. Some of it, for example, in productivity gains goes to training. Now, we talk about the skills crisis that we have. It's also true that music's an example, drama's an example, where our different training institutions that we have, the funding has not kept up over the years. There's a few different areas, and that is one of the inflationary impacts across the economy.
I want to come to the former minister, but Adam, you got anything to say here?
I'm not a musician. I do not know enough about that industry to know that. But, you know, when you talk about should there be a minimum wage for musicians, to be honest, I don't want to get into it, but it does. There's always going to be another effect that changes that. Does that mean that, you know, it's the death of the 8-piece band because, you know, it's going to be $2,000 every time you're booking an 8-piece band, and so every time you go to a gig, it's solo artists in a pub because they can only afford to pay $250 for a solo artist. So it's not my industry. I don't want to say anything that's going to offend my colleagues here, but I just... You need to listen to the industry to tell you whether that's a good thing for that industry.
Well, let's go to our next question. It comes from Oliver James Damien.
Darren and Katie,
Hey.
would you be willing to share with us how you were able to live through your experiences of mental distress and how that lived experience shaped your subsequent work?
Wow, thank you for asking that question. Would you like to go first? Or?
Up to you.
Okay.
I'm happy to chat, yep.
Well, I'm very open about the fact that I live with major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. So for a couple of reasons, I'll try to keep it brief. I grew up in a family with a violent alcoholic father, so he was physically abusive to my mother and to us as children. So I'm 50 now and I still go to therapy every week because of the results of that. I also inherited and proudly live with, but a depressive disorder that comes mostly from my mother's side of the family, and 2 people in my immediate family have committed suicide. So I am very lucky that I was born in a country with an amazing healthcare system. I unfortunately live in a country at the moment with an atrocious healthcare system. And I am just always advocating about this country and how incredibly lucky we are to have access to this. But I really survive and am here today because of access to therapy and medication. I describe my mental health condition as kind of like a superpower. It allows me to see a spectrum of colours that I don't think everyone gets to see. I think that sometimes the emotions that I feel allow me to soar to great heights and dive to great depths that help me in my artistry.
And the question also mentioned how it affects your work. Your current single is called Poison Blood.
Poison Blood, yeah.
And it's about exactly that. It's about what
that
runs through the blood. Yeah.
Yes, and I say in that song, I say it's a blessing, a gift and a curse, but every day is a decision to stay with my poison blood.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I know that was something that concerned you deeply during the pandemic for you, but also for friends of yours who are really struggling during that time.
Yeah, honestly, look, when the pandemic started, I was just waiting for the suicides to begin.
Why?
Because we just went to nothing, and our entire, well, economically, of course, but also just, anyway.
Connection.
Yeah, I was very, very worried, and I'm amazed actually at how resilient we have been.
Did you and others have to be very vigilant about each other?
Absolutely, yeah. But in answer to your question, basically music has been my best friend since I was 2. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a family that appreciated music and the importance of it in everyday life. My dad's a journo, former ABC journo. My mum's an opera singer. So I grew up in a house that valued these things. The problem that I think we're facing at the moment, and this comes back to what I said before, is that music and arts education is not valued in this country. Only 25% of state schools have a qualified music teacher. Every single school has a PE teacher. I'm guessing, I would guess. So we have these 2 cultures that are integral to making a well-rounded human. And there is a plethora of research that says that music education and arts education increases numeracy, literacy, all of the things. So we know all this, but we've just never had the policy to implement it in Australia. And it is so depressing for me that 75% of state school educated kids don't have music to help them through their lives. If I didn't have music as a teenager, I'm not sure if I'd still be here. Like, honestly, like it's actually has helped me so much, and music has helped. So that's sort of my pet dream, is that we do finally have some cultural advocacy at a national level that prioritises quality music education. And the thing is, every child has an instrument, their voice. Everyone that can talk can sing. Kids aren't singing together, they're looking at screens, you know, like, for example, where I live, I'm a mum of 2 boys and I live on Gubbi Gubbi country. The state school where our kids went to school, the music department was a joke and not prioritised at all, but they had beautiful sports fields and a great soccer thing and a basketball thing, and I love those cultures as well. But it was dire, so I ended up starting my own music school. Hello, your Monday School of Rockers, getting ready for our gig soon, because I just thought, and we've given free scholarships to over 150 kids, and the great thing is you get grammar kids and you get single mum kids, Steiner kids, the whole spectrum. But in the moment, they have music to help them, and without it, seeing them bloom as young humans, it's just amazing.
I want to bring in Renata Beslick now. Renata sent in a question earlier, and you work in the industry. I think you're a supervisor in opera and theatre, and you've had your own mental health struggles as well. What did you want to say here?
Yeah, I've been in the industry 15 years. I've worked in opera and theatre as a costume supervisor. I've always had mental health issues. I think it's just almost the standard in the arts. We're passionate people. I think the population of people with mental health issues is more in the arts. But since the pandemic, everyone I know has struggled. A whole industry as mental health has collapsed. I employ people, they're struggling. My bosses are struggling, I'm struggling.
And the link for you between that struggle, that mental health struggle, and the unreliable nature of work and gig-based economy, that's a really strong one for you, isn't it?
That's when, you know, you live from gig to gig. Financially, you're stressing about that. You're worrying about your value. You're worried it's competitive. You know, you're hoping you could do a good job. You're not sure. You know, I work behind the scenes. We often don't get reviews. We hope we're doing well. And finding, you know, suddenly all your work gone during the pandemic was unbelievably hard. Never mind from a financial perspective. Like, I came into the industry because it's collaborative and social, and to suddenly have that gone was just so isolating. And, you know, not knowing when your next gig is going to be, when you're going to get a paycheck again. And it's standard all the time, but then the pandemic just made it so much worse, and it's still bad. It's still really hard.
Renata, thank you. That's painting a really pointed picture there that everyone here has experienced, but, you know, people at home might not know, so thank you for that. What arises from that, of course, is the issue that we need to acknowledge, don't we, that cultural workers are legitimate workers. Like others. They're not hobbyists.
No.
And that perhaps some of the industry settings and even the payments have reflected that isn't as serious as, say, a mine worker losing their job. So if the focus is going to be on how you build an arts economy that's as integral to society as manufacturing or as agriculture, and that's sustainable and part of any future economy, how do you do that? And I know you've said, Minister, that you're going to revive the arts policy that was Julia Gillard's. I'm just wondering if that is the right way to start, given that's a long time ago, that's pre-pandemic, the world has changed since then. So how do you do that?
Yeah, we're not photocopying it and just reintroducing it.
But that's going to be your entry point.
That's right,
yes.
That's right. And it's because it started with the right 5 principles. It started with First Nations, the diversity of Australia, the centrality of the artist, having strong institutions and reaching your audience. In terms of those 5 principles, you start with that, you've got the right foundation.
Maybe a 6th needs to be added, which is insecurity. Recognising fundamental job and wage insecurity.
That was the 3rd one, the centrality of the artist. That's not just the artist as creator, it's the artist as worker. And that goes to 2 things that I think have been underdone, which have both been exposed really badly over the last 3 years in particular. One, and it's because of the pandemic. That's not a government hit, or previous government hit. It's me now. But
I knew someone was going to make that mistake tonight. I thought it would be me.
But it's because, one, the insecurity issues were just up in lights because of the pandemic. But secondly, the safe workplace issues, because of Me Too, have mean that what we have to look at now won't and can't simply be a photocopy of what we had before. So will we be able to fix every problem? No. Should we be able to build a stronger foundation? I believe we can.
All right, let's move on to our next question. But if this discussion has raised any issues for you, remember the numbers for Lifeline and Beyond Blue are there on your screen. We're always happy to speak openly about mental health challenges, but that, of course, can raise issues, so please take advantage of those services. Our next question comes from Kathy Howard.
Panel, hi. I've been lucky enough to work with Michael Gudinski, who some of you would know very well, and Michael Gudinski is dearly departed. But most importantly, Michael would have wanted us all to really live by his motto, which is do it and do it now. And that was something that he practiced in his work every single absolute second. I know because I worked with him for a long, long time. He would have wanted us to infuse our energy, our belief in the power of music to bring joy, to help people, young people, come through the ranks at a time when the industry globally, not just in Australia, needs this. So he would have wanted us to create things, to do things, to help young people through, to help people who are in the industry to move through the ranks to the next level.
Can I get you to come to your question, Kathy? What's your question?
That is my question to the panel and to everyone, to ask you what you are doing to help young people through the industry and for people to move through the ranks of the industry.
OK, we might make that a lightning round if we can. I feel we've got the answer from you actually already in terms of setting up the school.
Yeah, music education. Yep. We need to look to the future, and every child is an artist, every child is a musician, and if that's empowered from youth, they'll go into life. OK. Well, let's go around the panel just quickly, if we can, around that. Adam, if the motto from Michael Gudinski was "Do it now," what would that be that you could do or you are doing now?
Secure the industry, because I think, you know, often if your industry is insecure, you're looking for a safe pair of hands and you're looking for an experienced pair of hands. You're not looking to try out new talent when that could go wrong. If you've got a good safety net, if you've got, you know, if you know that this project isn't going to be the last one you do, you can invest in new talent. You can bring those young people up through the ranks.
Can I just pick up on that point? In screen policy, one of our focuses in government, and I hope the new government will continue this, was providing that longer pipeline of funding. So our location incentive program went through to 2026-27. Some 32 productions now funded by that. The most recent, Metropolis, which will be filming at Dockland Studios in Melbourne, an 8-part series based upon the 1920s science fiction movie. So the idea is that if there's a steady pipeline of these big global productions coming, rather than the boom-bust we've had, that makes it much easier for people to plan their careers and move from production to production.
Well, I'll come back to you, Adam, because that is your work. I mean, you work in production. You had so many overseas programs, I think, that you were going to shoot overseas, slated you didn't get to.
Yeah.
What's the fix?
One of the things that I do as a very practical level to try and get more young people onto the projects that I'm working on is when I'm crewing a project, I'll go to the youngest person that I worked on the last project with and said, who would you suggest for this role? And try and get that person to suggest someone new, because quite often they're going to be the right person for the role, because there's nothing that says you have to be a TV presenter or a cameraman for 10 years to know how to do it right. And, you know, I work with 17-year-old camera operators and I work with, you know, teenage sound recorders, and they're fabulous. And I want to be able to make sure that I can find editors that are young, the editors that are hungry, and editors, and, you know, people at every level of that industry, every level of production. And when you look at a production, it is not just the guy whose face is on the screen. There are hundreds of people that go into most productions.
Minister, I'll come to you.
Look, the thing that I'd add to what's already been said is we need to look at the ways that that revenue for artists is collapsing. So rip-off merchandise. You Google the name of a band and put the word T-shirt. The first thing you'll be taken to is a site where there's no copyright approval and the money's not going to the artist. Secondly, you type the name of a band or artist and type the word tickets. First thing you'll be taken to is Viagogo, where the tickets may or may not be legitimate and are not at the price point that the artist wanted. And thirdly, and this is complex, and I know we're talking about streaming later. But what has happened to artists' revenue with Spotify and the different music streaming forms has smashed artist revenue in many ways. And we need to work out how we can deal with that, because from album sales where, the artist wasn't getting all the money, but unless you're buying through Bandcamp or through the artist's website, if you're listening through a streaming service, it's just a fraction of money they're getting.
Sandra Walters is standing by and she'll be screaming in the audience wanting to ask her a question, so we'll come to that in a second. But I want to hear from Darren, just going back to our question about, do it now.
Sure. I love all these macro ideas. From my point of view, from a micro perspective, as my own independent label, as an employer, I try to build off what Adam says. I really try to invest in young talent. So, like, for example, my new album was mixed by really a first-time mix engineer, someone that was just an engineer. And
did that feel like a risk for you to take? Or?
Yes, but I loved it. It was so exciting and dangerous and amazing, and I loved empowering him. And I shoot a lot of music videos, and I employ a huge amount of crew, and I'm very aware of diversity, and in terms of giving people their first shot and giving people that exposure, and just little things that might sound a little bit pretentious, but just giving over my platform and really giving credit to emerging artists. So supporting emerging artists, new artists, just championing them. Because I've had my time in the spotlight, and so that might seem like a small thing, but for me, no one really did that for me, and I always try to use my public platform to champion young people and new people.
Well, let's go to our next question, and it comes from Sandra Walters.
Hi.
Hi.
Earlier this year, the former government ignored recommendations for streaming companies to spend 20% of their Australian revenue on local content, announcing a 5% target instead. Tony Burke, will you be recommending that 20% of the streaming services' Australian revenue be invested in new Australian content? And if so, would you support 20% of that sum going to children's TV?
To me?
Yeah.
We haven't made a decision on the number. It's going to be part of the cultural policy review, which is this year. It's not putting it off into the never, never. I do believe 5% was too low. And I do have a really strong view that the reason we have quotas is because whether it's on radio or on TV, it's because of the relationship between what's coming from the screen or the speaker and the person listening. It's not because whether it's coming through bandwidth versus the internet. And at the moment, we've allowed this complete shift to happen as to how people receive their content. And it's happening in a world where you don't have the minimum standards that you would have if they were receiving it anywhere else. That needs to be fixed. The longer we leave it, and we've now had nearly a decade where it was left, the longer we leave it, the harder it is to do.
Yeah. Adam, can I get your view on that as a content maker? Do you have a view on this? I
think we need pride in Australian-made content. Like I said, we are now in Australian-made. We look at manufacturing industries and we go, yes, I'm going to buy an Australian frying pan, or I'm going to buy an Australian-made chopping board. And that is a fabulous thing that there is so much money that we put back into our economy by doing that. And from a consumer level, I think we need to have that pride in Australian content too. I love watching Australian television. I love watching Australian movies. I love listening to Australian music. What the number is, what the politicians decide the number is for the streaming services, that's up to them. I don't know whether 10% or 15% or 20% is going to make the biggest difference.
But is the number enough? I mean, because don't you need some sort of requirement about what it is actually that you might make? Because some content quotas are reached here in Australia by, content that not everyone regards as necessarily, the new Game of Thrones or some brilliant new drama.
You can't be judgmental about somebody's content. There's an audience for it, and somebody's going to watch it. I don't mind if it's if we're not investing in the next Bluey, we'll be investing in the next Mad Max. It's all valuable art. Everybody's art is valuable in that respect.
Well, let me come to the previous minister. The French government's just finalised a new framework that means that global video streaming on demand platforms are going to have to invest 20% of their French revenues into local production, and that's split 80-20 between TV and theatrical films. That means that Netflix alone is going to invest 200 million euros this year and 40 million to theatrical feature films. Was it a mistake not to get on board and to put in place a similar regulatory framework here?
Well, far from not getting on board, what we did in government was went through a process to look carefully at this issue, hear the views of all the stakeholders, and we arrived at a model where we said that there would be a formal reporting requirement on the percentage of the Australian revenue that was being spent on Australian content. So the first thing you need to do is put that reporting requirement in place, and then the mechanism we proposed was
You don't have to. You don't have to go through that. You can actually just go straight to a quota requirement.
Well, you do have to, because you have to know how much they're actually spending in Australia. They won't tell you unless you formally ask them. So yes, you do have to do it. And so we have worked through this process. It's uncontentious that there needs to be Australian content on streaming services. Yes, just as there's Australian content on free-to-air television. So we've gone through a process. We had a set of recommendations ready to go. That'll now be a matter for the new government, and they'll need to work through those issues. There's some significant technical issues, what constitutes Australian content, but the basic principle, if the streaming services are making good money in Australia, now over 70% of Australian households now have a streaming service, then yes, the streaming services should be contributing towards Australian content.
I know you're dying to get in here. Just very, very briefly, though, what's been left for you? Is it any good?
Well, I just need to take
just quickly, Tony Burke, if I can.
Yeah. But you tried to cut the Foxtel Australian content in half. You abolished the requirement on free-to-air for children's content. And a decade on, you said, oh, maybe we're about to do something on streaming. In terms of Australian content, this is not a proud record.
Can I just say it's so depressing that we're talking about 5%? As a musician, if you go to Canada, Canadian radio sounds Canadian.
Yeah.
You listen to the radio in Australia, it doesn't sound Australian.
What's the requirement in Canada? Is there a formal...
25%. Right. Here,
on radio?
6.25.
I thought it was like 40%.
Well, last I heard it was 25. Maybe it's even
40%.
better. But here, APRA had to fight tooth and nail to get it to 6.25%. When we're talking about dignity as an artist, how depressing is it that we're fighting and you're talking about 5%? I mean, come on, it has to be 25%.
Well, I know Tina Arena has always said that, in order to meet the quota, they play her songs, but they play them at 2 in the morning.
Evening.
But that's the thing.
2 in the morning.
So, and they play it between 12... midnight and 5 a.m. and, it's so depressing that our art is so undervalued that we're talking about 5%. We're not talking about 50%, but at least 25, I think, is a real...
So the streaming services can expect there will be some requirement from them?
Radio,
oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
You're prepared to talk percentages tonight if it's not going to be 5?
No, because decision's not made, so I'm not going... But terms of...
upward of 5?
And I've met with them before the election and I said, if we win, this is what we will do.
And were they happy to hear that?
They weren't in love with it. They weren't in love with it. But I was saying if we win, we'll be the government of Australia. And if we're the government of Australia, we're going to back Australian content.
And it's been so long since we've had a federal voice actually advocating for our arts. I mean, Keating was the last one, and that's a long time between drinks.
Oh dear, you have to turn out to be a new Paul Keating. Can you do that?
No one ever can. No one ever should try.
I'm sure Paul Fletcher's probably quite happy about that, Paul. Let's go to our next question. It comes
I'll take
from...
that as a rhetorical question.
You can probably take it as a comment. Our next question comes from Jasper Twig.
Australians of my generation will probably see massive technology disruption through trends like artificial intelligence. This is going to throw up big questions that can only be answered through the study of arts disciplines like philosophy, for example. Things like what sort of ethical values should we program into a self-driving car is an example of a question. So my question to the panel tonight is, do you think that as Australians we have studied enough and we have studied these areas enough, and are we equipped to think about these issues in a positive and constructive way?
It's a really interesting question, and I wonder if it's even going on in music already. But Adam, I'm going to come to you first.
Thank you so much.
I reckon you might have an interesting take on this.
Well, I reckon Australia is a world leader in AI art. There is the Eurovision AI Song Contest, and Australia won that this year with a song by Charlton Hill and, I believe, a computer.
But is it any good?
It was great. It fused together native Australian bush noises and music that is written based on, I think, listening to 1,000 hours of Katie Noonan and Darren Hayes. I'm not quite sure. But,
But the question is about putting the heart of the humanities and arts at the centre of any AI, not making it an engineering task, but actually a humanities task.
I don't even know how to answer that, to be entirely honest. But we don't need to have a consensus before we move forward with an idea. You know, we should be allowed to move forward with ideas that are not fully baked and to learn as we go along. What that means for AI, I'm not entirely sure, but we don't need to agree that art has to have art. You know, art is okay for art's sake. And like I said, you know, let 1,000 Byron Bays bloom if you want to make television, because you don't have to like it, because somebody's going to like it. The audience will decide what it wants to watch.
It's all right, you've told me I'm a snob already. I got it the first time. AI in music, that's auto-tune, isn't it?
Well, actually what it is deciding what content you get to. Katie, you'll know what I'm talking about here in terms of, this is really creepy actually. So I come from an era, a long time ago, when a song would be taken to a thing called radio, and someone would play a song and a person who had a job would listen to it and decide if that song should be on radio. Now what happens is 15 seconds of a song is taken to a platform called TikTok, and it's tested there. And if the algorithm picks up on it, and if people respond to it, then maybe it might get to a pitch meeting where someone might hear 15 seconds of it, and it might get on the radio. So you have a wonderful AI, and I have friends that were involved in that Eurovision song, by the way, and the person who was involved in making that algorithm is an extraordinary artist. So it's not a judgment and a moral dilemma in that respect. It's incredible, but there are some pretty creepy, because what we're being exposed to, which comes back to like what we talked about in terms of how Spotify and how these streaming platforms are actually delivering content to us, and what we're getting to see is being decided really by a purely financial model, which is the antithesis of art, really. We want to be exposed to as much music and film and TV and food.
I don't know, I reckon the early days of rock and roll and pop music in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it worked that way as well. It was, you know, one guy in an office at EMI or whatever it was, and they decided whether it was music or not.
They did, but
not this, you know, rubbish here.
But you listened to the radio and...
But if it never made it to radio, you never heard it.
True. There were no robots, though. There were no robots.
There were no robots.
Only Star Wars.
Does humanities need to be at the heart of the robots we're going to be making? I mean, you've got to be thinking about AI here. Minister, what do you reckon?
Yeah, well, I think it goes beyond AI. It goes to the concept as to whether art subjects, generally, are essential. Like, that's what it goes to. And, you know, I hope we never again get into the debate that somehow those courses aren't training people for real jobs. I really hope we don't go back to that. You know, even if you go to your most high-tech thing like a mobile phone, most of the value of it is actually design. That's most of the value of what you're looking at there. And so I think the AI is an example, but effectively for everything that is important and critically important about science, technology and engineering and mathematics, all of that only reaches the public in a meaningful way if you've got the arts, design, cultural focus actually making sure it reaches an audience properly.
Can I pick up on that? Because I want to agree with Tony. It seems to me that we're in a world where more and more of us are doing thinking work. There's less and less physical labour, and so therefore the thinking work, the creativity that is inherent in the arts, that's more and more important in every sector. And I think one indicator of that is looking at the kind of career paths that people who go to Australian Film, Television and Radio School or NIDA, where people with that background are ending up. It's quite diverse across the economy. So, you know, I think this is a time when those art skills, that inherent creativity, is more valuable and more used across all of our society than ever before.
Yeah.
Katie?
I'd have to agree, yeah, creative thinking and philosophy and, you know, the arts is how we understand who we are, basically. But my sort of, you know, pet thing is until we have quotas that celebrate and champion Australian stories, and that's for every single company that gets federal funding from the Australia Council or the government, I have a simple philosophy that you commit to 25% Australian storytelling and song making, or you don't get your funding. It's as simple as that. So you still do Beethoven and you do
AI or no
Can I
AI?
just pick up on, Virginia, the conversation you were having with Darren, because it's a really fascinating...
Just very quickly.
It's a fascinating change, the point you made, the democratisation of, you know, who becomes a star because of the enormous abundance of content. There's so much around. That choice process is now not being done by a small number of well-paid people.
Except TikTok's owned by one really wealthy person.
That's a huge, but it's a huge change in the way that, as a society, you know, we decide who's going to be the star. I think we're still working through the implications of that.
We've got our final question now before we get to our terrific performance from Katie, and it comes from Thomas Walters.
Hi. My question's for Darren and Katie. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what the best city in the world for live music is, and what do you think Australian governments, venues and patrons could be doing to make our cities more like that city?
Well, that's just a ridiculous question. The answer is Melbourne, of course.
I knew someone was going to say that.
Honestly.
The answer's you Monday,
and that's all we have time for. All right, to quote Kanye, I'm going to let you answer that.
Oh, look, I have to say Brisbane because I came from there and I just am...
Me too. Woo!
Yeah, I just think what I love about Brisbane is that I love feeling like an underdog, and we always felt like that. Don't you feel like that?
Yep.
So I think anywhere, I'm sure Daniel Johns would say, you know, Newcastle.
Yeah.
You know, I think what's so great about being an Australian in general is that we just feel so far away from the rest of the world that we just try that little bit harder. And
which does make for really interesting work.
it does, and to have something to push against. And I know we're just complaining about a lot of adversity, but adversity can be a wonderful creative
we've got
spark.
Brisbane and Newcastle. We can pick from the whole world here, Tony Burke.
Hey, for me, Sydney. I'm not going to change from that. And I love...
Go the Maroons!
But I love the small venues that have turned up now.
Yeah.
So I'll often go, there's a couple of small venues at Marrickville that I absolutely love. The biggest poetry gathering in Australia now is at Bankstown.
Yeah.
Awesome. So those little suburban ones that are around now, I just adore.
Honestly, though, my favourite gigs are regional Australia. Going to the middle of nowhere, working in community. When you go to these tiny towns and you play the little country hall, they really are my favourite gigs.
Adam?
I do think it's important to recognise the value of the small room. You know, I grew up in Adelaide and you'd walk into your local pub and see a Furler was there singing with her band back in my day, and now she's obviously the global superstar. But that's where the art starts. It doesn't start in, you know, the entertainment centres. It starts in the local pub or the small room where you get to see an artist doing their thing.
Yeah. Paul?
Look, for me, a special memory, you get many privileges as an arts minister, but seeing Electric Fields performing at the Natsias in Darwin, outside, 35 degrees, it was just stunning. Stunning.
That's surprisingly cool.
That's a very good finish.
Even for a Liberal, why don't you say that?
Even for
I know what you're thinking.
For an arts minister is what I'm thinking. Former. I'm sure they all meant to say Melbourne. That's sort of really all I heard. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel: Darren Hayes, Tony Burke, Katie Noonan, Adam Liaw and Paul Fletcher. And thank you for your questions, and to you at home for joining the conversation and streaming us on iView. Next week, I'll be live from Melbourne, taking a close look at Australia's energy crisis. And we'll put your questions to a panel of politicians, industry leaders and big thinkers. So, what better way to close the show than live music from Katie Noonan and the Australian Vocal Ensemble. So here they are performing a piece by Burke, sung in German and Indigenous languages ahead of their Sydney show in August. Good night.
Drum soll das tun.